Adolf Hitler, Germany, April 30, 1945. Picture this: Berlin, April 1945. Soviet artillery shells are exploding just blocks away from Hitler's underground bunker. The man who promised a 1,000-year Reich knows his empire is crumbling after just 12 years. In his final days, Hitler was a shadow of his former self: trembling hands, yellowed teeth, and a stoop that made him look decades older than his 56 years. On April 29, he married his longtime companion Eva Braun in a bizarre ceremony that lasted just minutes. Less than 24 hours later, both would be dead. Hitler shot himself in the right temple while Eva bit down on a cyanide capsule. Their bodies were immediately carried upstairs, doused in gasoline, and burned in the Reich Chancellery garden as Soviet troops closed in. What makes this story particularly chilling is Hitler's final political testament, dictated just hours before his death. Even facing total defeat, he showed no remorse, instead blaming the war on international Jewry. His bodyguard later described finding the couple's bodies slumped together on a blood-soaked sofa a grotesque end to history's most destructive regime. The irony wasn't lost on those who witnessed it. The man who sent millions to their deaths in gas chambers chose poison for his own wife's final moments. Hitler's suicide wasn't just the end of a dictator, it was the collapse of Nazi Germany's entire power structure in a single gunshot. Benito Mussolini, Italy, April 28, 1945. Mussolini's end reads like a Shakespearean tragedy with an Italian twist. By April 1945, Il Duce was no longer the bombastic leader who had marched on Rome in 1922. He was a broken man, fleeing north toward Switzerland with his mistress Clara Petacci and a small convoy of die-hard fascists. Communist partisans stopped their convoy near Lake Como on April 27. Mussolini tried to disguise himself in a German greatcoat and helmet, but his famous jutting jaw gave him away. The partisans recognized him instantly. What happened next shocked even hardened resistance fighters. They executed both Mussolini and Petacci on the spot, along with several other fascist officials. But the story doesn't end with their deaths. The partisans transported the bodies to Milan's Piazzale Loreto, the same square where fascists had displayed the bodies of executed partisans months earlier. Angry crowds gathered, spitting on the corpses, kicking them, and screaming decades of pent-up rage. Then came the moment that defined Mussolini's legacy. Someone strung up his body by the ankles alongside Petacci's, hanging them upside down from a gas station's metal girders. Photographs of Mussolini's inverted corpse, his face grotesquely swollen and unrecognizable, appeared in newspapers worldwide. The man who had styled himself as a new Caesar ended up as a public spectacle, a cautionary tale about the price of absolute power. His granddaughter later said the family never recovered from the shame of that public humiliation. Joseph Stalin, Soviet Union, March 5, 1953. Stalin's death remains one of history's greatest mysteries, wrapped in layers of Soviet secrecy and paranoia. On March 1, 1953, the 74-year-old dictator was found lying in his own urine on his dacha floor by terrified guards who hadn't dared check on him for nearly 12 hours. They were too afraid of interrupting his privacy. The official cause was cerebral hemorrhage, but the circumstances were deeply suspicious. Stalin had been increasingly paranoid in his final months, planning another massive purge targeting Jewish doctors, the so-called doctor's plot. He trusted no one, not even his closest associates, who had grown tired of living in constant fear of midnight arrests and execution. Here's where it gets interesting. His inner circle, including Nikita Khrushchev and Lavrentiy Beria, delayed medical treatment for crucial hours. Some historians believe they deliberately let him die, seeing his death as the only way to save themselves and the Soviet Union from another reign of terror. Beria was reportedly seen celebrating Stalin's condition before the dictator was even dead. The irony is profound. Stalin, who had ordered the deaths of millions through executions, forced famines, and gulags, may have been murdered by the very system he created. His death sparked a power struggle that would reshape the Soviet Union. Within months, Beria himself was arrested and executed, proving that in Stalin's system, even survival required someone else's death. The man who had mastered the art of political murder became its final victim. Mao Zedong, China, September 9, 1976. Mao's final years were a medical nightmare that his doctors dared not fully treat. The chairman was suffering from a rare motor neuron disease, possibly LS, that gradually paralyzed his body while leaving his mind intact, a cruel fate for a man obsessed with control. By 1976, he could barely speak, communicating through written notes and grunts that only his closest aides could interpret. What makes Mao's death particularly tragic is the timing. China was still reeling from the Cultural Revolution's devastation, and Mao knew his radical policies had caused massive suffering. His personal physician, Dr. Li Jisui, later revealed that Mao spent his final months haunted by the knowledge that his economic experiments had led to the deaths of tens of millions during the Great Chinese Famine. On September 8, Mao suffered a massive heart attack while reading in bed. Appropriately, he died surrounded by the books and ideas that had shaped his revolutionary worldview. But here's the chilling detail. His inner circle, led by his wife Jiang Qing and the Gang of Four, tried to control news of his death for their own political advantage, keeping his conditions secret for hours. The announcement of Mao's death triggered an outpouring of grief across China, but also relief among many who had lived through decades of political upheaval. Within weeks, the Gang of Four was arrested, and China began its transformation toward the market economy we know today. Mao died believing he had created a perfect communist state, but his death actually marked the beginning of capitalism's return to China, the ultimate irony for history's most powerful Marxist leader. Nicolae Ceausescu, Romania, December 25, 1989. Christmas Day 1989 became Romania's Day of Liberation when Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu faced a firing squad in a military barracks outside Bucharest. Just 4 days earlier, they had been the absolute rulers of Romania, living in obscene luxury while their people suffered through bread lines and power outages. The Romanian Revolution erupted with shocking speed. What started as protests in Timișoara spread nationwide within days. On December 21, Ceausescu's final public speech turned into a disaster when the crowd began booing and chanting against him, a moment captured on live television that showed the world his power was crumbling. The couple fled Bucharest by helicopter on December 22, but their pilot, fearing for his life, landed after just a few minutes. They commandeered a car, were captured by local police, and found themselves prisoners of the very system they had controlled for decades. Their trial lasted just 1 hour, a kangaroo court that sentenced them to death for genocide and economic sabotage. The execution was filmed, and the footage remains deeply disturbing. Nicolae appeared defiant to the end, singing the Communist International even as soldiers raised their rifles. Elena, once known as the mother of the nation, begged for her life. The irony was stark. The couple who had lived in palaces while their people froze in unheated apartments died in a cold, concrete room on Christianity's holiest day. Their deaths marked not just the end of their regime, but the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself would cease to exist. Saddam Hussein, Iraq, December 30, 2006. Saddam's execution was supposed to demonstrate the triumph of justice over tyranny, but it became a sectarian spectacle that revealed Iraq's deep divisions. The former dictator who had ruled Iraq for nearly 25 years with an iron fist spent his final 3 years as a prisoner, reduced from a man who had owned dozens of palaces to someone living in a 6-by-9-foot cell. His capture in December 2003 was humiliating. American forces found him hiding in a spider hole near his hometown of Tikrit, disheveled and carrying just $750,000 in cash. The man who had styled himself as a modern Nebuchadnezzar looked like a common fugitive. His trial for crimes against humanity lasted nearly 3 years, during which Saddam alternated between defiance and self-pity. On execution day, December 30, 2006, Saddam maintained his composure even as Shiite guards taunted him with chants praising his rival, Muqtada al-Sadr. The illegal cell phone video of his hanging shows him facing death with dignity, even as his executioners violated Islamic law by mocking him. His final words were reportedly, "Down with the traitors, down with the invaders, down with the Persians." The execution solved nothing. Rather than bringing closure to Iraq, it intensified sectarian violence and created a martyr figure for Sunni insurgents. The man who had promised to unite the Arab world instead became a symbol of how quickly absolute power can crumble. His death marked the end of secular Arab nationalism in Iraq and paved the way for the chaos that would eventually spawn ISIS, proving that sometimes the aftermath of a dictator's death can be worse than the dictatorship itself. Pol Pot. Cambodia, April 15, 1998. Pol Pot's death in a ramshackle hut near the Thai border was as mysterious as the man himself. The architect of Cambodia's killing fields, responsible for the deaths of nearly 2 million people, a quarter of Cambodia's population, spent his final years as a shadow of his former self, abandoned even by his own Khmer Rouge followers. By 1998, the 73-year-old former dictator was under house arrest by his own forces, who had grown tired of his extremism and were negotiating with the Cambodian government. Pol Pot knew his time was up. The international community was finally demanding justice for the Cambodian genocide, and his former allies were preparing to hand him over for trial. On April 15, his wife found him dead in his bed. The official cause was heart failure, but the circumstances were deeply suspicious. He had been in good health just days earlier, and witnesses reported hearing him say he wanted to kill himself rather than be captured. Some believe he took poison. Others suspect his own guards murdered him to prevent him from revealing their secrets under interrogation. The irony of Pol Pot's death is profound. The man who had emptied Cambodia's cities, executed intellectuals for wearing glasses, and turned the country into a massive forced labor camp died peacefully in his sleep while his victims' families were still searching for answers. He never faced justice for his crimes, never showed remorse, and took his secrets to the grave. His quiet death stood in stark contrast to the screaming terror he had unleashed on Cambodia, a final insult to the millions who had suffered under his radical agrarian vision. Augusto Pinochet. Chile, December 10, 2006. General Pinochet's death at 91 robbed Chile of its chance for full justice, but not before the former dictator had become a global symbol of how the powerful can evade accountability. The man who had ruled Chile with an iron fist from 1973 to 1990 spent his final years fighting extradition requests and criminal charges from around the world. Pinochet's last decade was a legal nightmare. He was arrested in London in 1998 on Spanish charges related to torture and murder, spending 503 days under house arrest before being released on health grounds. Back in Chile, he faced over 300 criminal charges related to the deaths and disappearances of over 3,000 people during his regime, plus charges of tax evasion and embezzlement. On December 3, 2006, Pinochet suffered a massive heart attack. As he lay dying in Santiago's military hospital, protesters gathered outside, some mourning, others celebrating. His family insisted he receive Catholic last rites, despite the Church's condemnation of his human rights record. The cardiac arrest that killed him was fitting for a man whose regime had literally broken the hearts of thousands of Chilean families. The general who had claimed to save Chile from Marxist chaos died knowing that his economic miracle had been built on a foundation of torture centers and mass graves. His death certificate listed the cause as acute myocardial infarction, but many Chileans felt he died of something more poetic: the weight of his own crimes. Even in death, Pinochet remained divisive. His funeral was both mourned and protested, reflecting Chile's ongoing struggle to reconcile with its dark past. Francisco Franco. Spain, November 20, 1975. Franco's death was Spain's longest goodbye, a drawn-out medical drama that lasted weeks and symbolized the slow end of European fascism. The Caudillo who had ruled Spain for 39 years was dying inch by inch in Madrid's La Paz hospital, his body kept alive by machines while his dictatorship crumbled around him. By October 1975, the 82-year-old Franco was suffering from multiple organ failure, Parkinson's disease, and severe cardiac problems. His doctors, terrified of being blamed for his death, used every available technology to prolong his life: 24 blood transfusions, kidney dialysis, artificial breathing apparatus. It was a grotesque spectacle that Spanish newspapers couldn't ignore, even under strict censorship. What makes Franco's death fascinating is how it became a race against time between his failing body and Spain's need for political transition. His designated successor, Prince Juan Carlos, was quietly meeting with democratic opposition leaders while Franco lay unconscious. The Spanish people watched nervously, knowing their future hung in the balance of one old man's failing organs. Franco finally died on November 20th, exactly 39 years after the execution of José Antonio Primo de Rivera, founder of the Spanish Falange. His last words were reportedly a faint "thank you." Within days, Juan Carlos began dismantling the Franco regime and transforming Spain into a democracy. The general who had promised to restore Spain's imperial greatness instead became the last fascist dictator in Western Europe, his death marking the end of an era that had begun with Mussolini's march on Rome over 50 years earlier. Josip Broz Tito, Yugoslavia, May 4, 1980. Tito's death marked the beginning of Yugoslavia's tragic end. The master politician who had held together 6 republics, 5 nations, 4 languages, 3 religions, and 2 alphabets for 35 years died knowing his creation was already fracturing. His final months were spent in Ljubljana's medical center, where doctors were performing increasingly desperate procedures to save the 87-year-old leader's life. The medical crisis began with circulation problems in Tito's left leg, requiring amputation in January 1980. But gangrene had already spread through his system, and secondary infections overwhelmed his weakened immune system. For months, Yugoslavia watched anxiously as medical bulletins described their president's deteriorating condition. Everyone knew that Tito's death would unleash forces he had kept in check for decades. What makes Tito's death particularly poignant is who attended his funeral: 128 world leaders, including 4 kings, 31 presidents, 22 prime ministers, and 47 foreign ministers. It was one of the largest state funerals in history, reflecting Tito's unique position as a communist leader who had defied Stalin and helped create the non-aligned movement. But the real tragedy began after the funeral guests went home. Without Tito's iron will to hold it together, Yugoslavia began its descent into ethnic warfare. The man who had survived Stalin's attempts at assassination, Hitler's invasion, and decades of Cold War pressure couldn't survive his own success. His death proved that some nations exist only because of the leaders who created them. Within a decade, Yugoslavia had dissolved in blood, fulfilling Tito's darkest predictions about his country's future without him. Japan, December 23, 1948. Tojo's attempted suicide and eventual execution perfectly captured Japan's transition from militaristic empire to occupied democracy. The man who had led Japan into World War II and overseen some of history's worst war crimes tried to take his own life rather than face Allied justice, but even in this final act, he failed. On September 11, 1945, as American forces prepared to arrest him, Tojo shot himself in the chest with a .32 caliber pistol. But the bullet missed his heart, and American medics rushed to save his life not out of compassion, but to ensure he could stand trial for war crimes. The irony was bitter. American doctors worked frantically to preserve the life of a man who had ordered attacks on American soldiers. During his 3-year imprisonment and trial, Tojo underwent a remarkable transformation. The once arrogant general who had believed in Japan's divine destiny became a broken man who accepted full responsibility for Japan's wartime actions. His final testament, written before his execution, apologized to the Japanese people and acknowledged that Japan's military leaders had led the nation into disaster. On the night of December 23, 1948, Tojo was hanged at Tokyo's Sugamo prison along with 6 other war criminals. His last words were, "Tenno Hika Banzai, long live the emperor," showing that even in death, he remained loyal to the imperial system that had created him. The man who had promised to drive Western powers from Asia instead became a symbol of how quickly military might can collapse when confronted with superior force. His execution marked the end of Japan's militaristic era and the beginning of its transformation into a pacifist democracy. Kim Jong-il, North Korea, December 17, 2011. Kim Jong-il's death aboard his armored train was shrouded in the same secrecy that had defined his 17-year rule over North Korea. The dear leader, who had turned his country into a nuclear-armed prison state, died of a massive heart attack while traveling through the North Korean countryside, a fitting end for a man who had lived his entire life in carefully controlled environments. The official North Korean account claims Kim died on December 17, 2011, while conducting field guidance for the people's welfare. But intelligence agencies believe he may have died days earlier, with the regime carefully orchestrating the announcement to ensure a smooth succession to his youngest son, Kim Jong-un. The delay allowed North Korean officials to secure the military's loyalty and prevent any potential coups. What makes Kim Jong-il's death particularly surreal was North Korea's public response. State television showed millions of North Koreans weeping uncontrollably in the streets, wailing at statues, and collapsing with grief. Whether this emotion was genuine or performed under threat remains unknown, but it demonstrated the absolute control the Kim dynasty maintained over North Korean society. The medical details of his death reveal the contradictions of his rule. While North Koreans starved, Kim Jong-il suffered from diabetes, heart disease, and kidney problems, all conditions related to his luxurious lifestyle. He died surrounded by the finest medical equipment money could buy, attended by doctors who had been trained abroad, in a country where ordinary citizens had no access to basic healthcare. His death changed nothing for ordinary North Koreans, who simply traded one Kim for another in history's only communist hereditary dictatorship. Fidel Castro. Cuba, November 25, 2016. Castro's death at 90 marked the end of an era. He was the last of the Cold War titans, outlasting 10 American presidents and surviving over 600 assassination attempts. The revolutionary who had defied the United States for nearly 6 decades died peacefully in Havana, his exact cause of death never officially disclosed, maintaining the mystery that had surrounded him throughout his life. Castro had been gradually transferring power to his brother Raúl since 2006, when intestinal problems nearly killed him. For his final decade, the once verbose leader who had delivered speeches lasting 8 hours rarely appeared in public, becoming more symbol than active ruler. Cuban state media showed occasional photos of him meeting with visiting dignitaries, but these carefully staged appearances only emphasized how frail he had become. The announcement of Castro's death at 10:29 p.m. on November 25 triggered remarkably different reactions depending on geography. In Havana, the news was met with solemn silence and carefully orchestrated mourning. In Miami's Little Havana, Cuban exiles celebrated in the streets, dancing and banging pots, a celebration that had been anticipated for decades. Castro's death raised profound questions about Cuba's future. The man who had transformed Cuba from American playground to socialist state died knowing his revolution faced an uncertain future. The Soviet Union that had subsidized his regime was gone, Venezuela's support was weakening, and younger Cubans increasingly questioned the system he had created. His death didn't end Cuban communism, but it marked the beginning of its inevitable transformation, proving that even the most durable dictatorships cannot outlast their creators forever. Thanks for watching this video to the end. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. We will love to know the country you are watching from in the comments section, and if you have any video ideas that you will love us to work on, don't hesitate to drop it in the comments section. See you soon in our next videos.